Okay, I believe we're going to go ahead and get started. Apologies for the technical difficulties. Even 19 months into this virtual world, we still run into hiccups sometimes. I will remind everybody that today's event is recorded, and everyone that is registered will have access to the recordings of all of our speakers today. So with that, welcome, and we're so excited to have you to our second annual Patient Advocacy Summit. Events like this are so important to fostering a collaborative, patient-centered atmosphere, and we've seen the positive results of such collaboration all throughout the pandemic. Our Patient Advocacy Alliance, which was officially launched this past April of 2021, is just one example of the good that can be done when the patient advocacy community, industry, and legislators come together for a dialogue. And as a reminder, that was a direct outcome of our first annual Patient Summit last year, was to form this alliance. If you are not already involved with the alliance, I encourage you to look into joining and participating in our roundtable discussions that take place 3 different times throughout the year in order to connect those groups. So before we get into our program, it's very important that I thank all of our sponsors. Today's event is not possible without them. Advocates for Responsible Care, or ARXC, it was led by Dorothy, who's one of our speakers today. Thank you for your continued support and your leadership. And thank you support from Genentech, UCB, Johnson & Johnson, and Pfizer. And a big thank you to We Work for Health for being our presenting sponsor. We will hear from them prior to the keynote address at noon. We've got some amazing speakers and panels lined up for you today, and are especially thrilled to host Dr. Suresh Ramalingam and Congressman Drew Ferguson for our keynote discussion this afternoon. Thank you again for joining us today. And without any further ado, I'll turn things over to Melissa Bishop Murphy with Pfizer to introduce our first speaker and kick off the summit. Melissa?
Thank you, Maria. Welcome. I'm so thrilled to introduce Phyllis Arthur. Phyllis Arthur is Vice President for Infectious Diseases and Emerging Health Policy at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. In this role, Ms. Arthur is responsible for working with member companies in vaccine, antimicrobial resistance, molecular diagnostics, and biodefense on policy, legislative, and regulatory issues. Ms. Arthur joined BIO in July 2009 as the Director of Healthcare Regulatory Affairs. Prior to joining BIO, she worked in numerous marketing and sales positions for Merck & Company in their vaccines division. Over her 16-year career in vaccines, Ms. Arthur launched several exciting new vaccines in the United States and internationally. Ms. Arthur holds an MBA degree from Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Without further ado, our speaker, Ms. Phyllis Arthur.
Melissa, thanks so much. And thanks so much to Maria and the team at Georgia Bio. I'm really glad to be here to share with you some information about COVID-19, the vaccines, and do an update. I'm also going to talk a little bit about an update on the therapeutics as well. And so, Christina, I'll ask if we can pull up the slides. Lovely. Thank you so much. So again, I'm Phyllis Arthur with BIO. I've been working in the infectious disease space for more than 25 years. And I started at BIO during the H1N1 pandemic. And here we are again with another pandemic during my time at BIO. Next slide. So I always like to start with the good news on the vaccines. And this is one of those slides that now I have, pinned in the CDC page because it literally changes every day and has been changing positively in the last couple of weeks. We now have 181, almost 182 million Americans fully vaccinated. One of the other good things is we're seeing every week, every day, more and more people who are in those high risk categories who need a third dose get that vaccine. So 2.2 million people who fall into the category of immunocompromised have received a third dose of the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine. Extremely important for them to keep their long-term protection. I'll point you right to the middle of the slide as the really great news we're seeing Of the people eligible to get vaccinated, that is people who are 12 years of age or older, almost 75% of the American population has gotten at least one dose of vaccine. And this number had stalled for several weeks, but with the approval of the Pfizer vaccine by the FDA, and unfortunately the spike in Delta cases and more deaths and hospitalizations, you've seen some people who are sitting on the fence and were worried about getting vaccinated start to show up for vaccine. And we're starting to get into some numbers that hopefully can really impact the course of the pandemic in a positive way. Next slide. So I think we've all been tracking the numbers, and I was very happy to pull this up yesterday and see that we're starting to see a tick down in the cases and the hospitalizations, and that's certainly what we want to see. But obviously, the spike that we had that mirrored our worst spike ever is really a problem, and hopefully what we're going to see is we're going to be able to eliminate some of those pockets of non-vaccinated personnel and really start to see this number go exactly in the direction we want it to go, which is cases and hospitalizations decreasing. But you're still seeing the numbers higher than we want, but going in the right direction. Next slide. One of the things that's so important when you look at where the cases are is to look at how well we're doing at vaccinating certain populations. And this is a couple of weeks old, but I think indicative of part of the issue of what's driving the cases of COVID that we're seeing in those hospitalizations. So we have a very high level of vaccination for those over 50 or especially over 65 or 75. Obviously, at the beginning of the pandemic, we all knew that was the population that was going to the hospital, that was dying, older people in congregate settings, those who had underlying conditions, more likely at these ages. Those people were the first to get vaccinated, and we saw a precipitous drop, quite happily, in their severe disease, hospitalization, and death. Where I think we have more to do is certainly in this younger age category under 40 or 50, where the vaccination rate is not as high as we need it to be. And consequently, we're seeing that in those cases that are going to the hospital or dying. This is also true in the adolescent population, that where we're seeing an uptick in vaccination, but they weren't eligible at the beginning. And all of these people need to be vaccinated to protect those under 12 who cannot yet get vaccinated. So that impact, it shows the power of vaccines. Obviously, when you get an immunization rate that's high, and you see this very, very dramatic drop in cases and death when you accomplish that. Next slide. Obviously, we're all very aware that our big problem right now, and has been for multiple months, is the Delta variant of SARS-CoV-2. It has been a predominant strain for quite some time and shows no sign of letting up or relinquishing its space to another variant. Our hope is here that that the vaccination program we're doing can help us to protect people from Delta long term, and make space and make it so that there are no more other variants coming into the country. Next slide. So what do we know about the Delta variant? I think many of you have heard about this, but I think it's important to look at this variant and what it does and why, therefore, it's contributing to our overall spike in cases at the moment, what that means for what we need to do in terms of vaccines and treatment. So the Delta variant is nearly twice as contagious as the other variants we saw in the past. There's evidence to show that it actually spreads more quickly, incubates more quickly, results in more severe illness than all of the previous strains. And this is particularly true in unvaccinated persons, where people are showing symptoms sooner and they're having more severe illness as well. The greatest risk of transmission, of course, is among unvaccinated people. And given that it's more transmissible, if you have a bunch of unvaccinated people together, the likelihood that it'll bounce around all those people and cause illness in many of them is quite high. But we also know that fully vaccinated people can actually have Delta breakthrough cases, although that's not common. And remember, you're hearing this data from many different people, but 96% of the people who are hospitalized today with COVID are unvaccinated. So we know that breakthrough is possible, but by and large, the hospitals and severe hospitalizations and severe cases are happening in those who have not received any vaccine. But those who are vaccinated can unwittingly spread the virus to other people. And this is the reason why it's so important to have the discussions about the mask mandates we're having. We want to make sure we're protecting those who are vaccinated from breakthrough, and of course, protecting those who are unvaccinated until hopefully they get vaccinated. But the transmissibility of Delta and its ability to build high virus inside a person, it replicates rapidly and spreads quickly, is a reason why we need to continue to protect ourselves with multiple mitigating behaviors, masks indoors, as well as, of course, vaccination over time. Next slide. So I hope everyone's familiar with the great vaccines that are already available on the US market and several more that are to come. I'm very excited about what's happened with Pfizer. They got actual full FDA approval for those, I think it's 16 and up, right, Melissa? 16 and up in August of 2021. I'm going to talk about the booster dose in a couple of slides, but obviously they've submitted for a booster. We're waiting for the FDA final approval. In addition, you have the Moderna vaccine that received its EUA in December, full approval expected very soon for that product. And you have the J&J vaccine, which is one shot, got their emergency use authorization in February, and will be seeking further approvals as they move forward. So these three vaccines represent two very important novel approaches to making vaccines. Very important because they allow us to potentially go quickly in development in a pandemic, but they also can be used in multiple different populations and potentially with multiple different viruses, not just COVID, but hopefully flu and cytomegalovirus, other viruses that we have big unmet medical need in multiple populations. And then later we should see some other vaccines that use other technologies that can help us, again, have more power in moving quickly in a pandemic. Next slide. I want to just, because we're talking to a patient groups, I want to actually reinforce the fantastic way that Pfizer, Moderna, I don't have a slide for J&J, but they also did this, but the commitment that Pfizer, Moderna, and all the vaccine manufacturers made to having the broadest possible diversity in their clinical trials. Both companies, all three companies actually made a lot of effort to make sure that the clinical trials they were doing in the United States and worldwide reflected the diversity of people who would need to get the vaccine. So race, gender, ethnicity, underlying conditions and comorbidities. And this was very important because we really haven't had very many vaccines that need to vaccinate everyone from literally birth to death. and we need to be able to show people that these vaccines could work well in anyone who had an underlying condition, had different occupational risk, had different racial and ethnic criteria, or were in different race genders. And that's really important when you're looking at population health like this. So Pfizer enrolled more individuals in order to make sure they had great data, 10% African-American, over 20% Latinx, many people, healthcare workers, many people with underlying conditions like diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease. Next slide. Same true for Moderna. They had a large healthcare worker enrollment, also hit about 10 or 12% African-American, 20% Latin American, and had many of the people had those comorbidities that were so important for COVID in terms of making sure we protected people from the more serious consequences. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about the side effects because, you know, I think we'll talk a few minutes about the benefits of these vaccines. I think we understand the context, but it's important to understand the side effects as well. By and large, across the board, these vaccines are generally well tolerated. You're going to see a lot of the side effects, if you haven't gotten it already, that you see with routine vaccination. Sore arm, redness, swelling. Some people have a headache, muscle ache. You have some of those systemic issues, muscle pain, fatigue. We saw a few people had allergic reactions. Obviously, the most important of those is anaphylaxis. So that shortness of breath that can indeed be serious. We saw a few cases of that with the vaccines, all treated right in the moment when people had the allergic reaction and people resolved. It's very important. That's why you have the 15 to 30-minute wait after your vaccine to make sure you don't have an allergic reaction. We have seen in the post-marketing of these 3 vaccines a few rare side effects come up. I'm just going to touch on them. This is not to frighten anyone. It's to make sure people understand that there are some rare side effects. We understand them. They're treatable. And again, show you how rare they are in the millions of doses that have been administered. So we've seen some cases of myocarditis or pericarditis. This is a mild inflammation of the heart. It's reported mainly in adolescents and young adults and predominantly males. We've seen about 1,400 cases that have been reported through the adverse event system. About 817 of these have been confirmed, and that's over 367 million doses of the vaccine administered. So again, I want to give you some idea of the rareness by showing you both the numerator and the denominator over which these are happening. We also saw an issue with a rare blood clot disorder with the J&J vaccine. This is a very interesting combination of a blood clot in the presence of a low platelet count. This is unusual. It required some that the FDA and CDC help doctors understand how to treat this issue. You need to treat it differently than you would treat a blood clot normally. And that was one of the reasons why this was highlighted as a key side effect that needed specific clinical guidance for clinicians. You see it mainly in females under 50. We've had about 45 cases in 14 million doses administered. And then a Guillain-Barré syndrome, something we see with other vaccines as well, is the immune system actually damaging some nerve cells. It causes muscle weakness. Most people, it resolves very quickly. So a few people do have long-term side effects of GBS, mainly in men over 50, about 185 reports in 14 million doses. So again, very, very rare. No, we know what to look for, and you should definitely know if you're getting vaccinated, what to look for, what are the signs, and be able to talk to a healthcare provider quickly. Treating these things when you see them can generally result in complete resolution of the issue. Next slide. So why do we want everyone to get vaccinated? And I think all of you who are dealing with patient groups that may have underlying conditions, understand the importance of protecting against infectious diseases in the overall health of the patients and the constituents you represent. So we know these vaccines are highly protective. We saw in the clinical trials 94, 95, 96% protection against severe, mild disease, moderate disease, severe disease. But we've seen, even with the shifts in the different variants, that these vaccines have remained protective against severe disease, hospitalization, and death, but 80, 90% across the board. It's really important for those who are immunocompromised to get that third dose of the mRNA vaccine to make sure that they retain that high protection against the most severe consequences. While we see breakthrough infection, again, this is generally less severe. It resolves sooner in the unvaccinated person. But we have to remember the breakthrough case can spread illness to others and to take precautions. And I think one of the most important reasons to get vaccinated is to prevent the long COVID symptoms. So long COVID is something being studied robustly, but it's a complicated and long-term impact on the overall health of the individual. Respiratory issues that endure, muscle issues that endure, that loss of taste, many of these particular symptoms, and it's over 100 different symptoms in the long COVID family, can really affect quality of life moving forward. We also need to get vaccinated to protect others. I think that we know children under 12 can't be vaccinated yet. We need to cocoon them with vaccinated people at school, at daycare, at work. And seniors and immunocompromised people can have breakthrough. And so both of those populations on the two spectrums need the protection of being surrounded by vaccinated persons. And lastly, I'll say the reason there's been so many variants are there's so many hosts for these viruses to literally get in, replicate themselves, spread quickly. The most advantageous and strongest variants are the ones that replicate quickly. They generally have more transmissibility or more disease, and they are very opportunistic in terms of moving from one host to another. The more vaccinated people we have, the less hosts there are, and the less opportunity for replication and variation. Next slide. So I'll talk about the booster shots really quickly. On Friday of last week, the FDA's independent advisory panel reviewed the data for Pfizer's booster dose. They decided that they would recommend that the FDA grant an authorization for a booster dose 6 months after the primary series for those who are 65 plus and the population that's of high risk of serious illness. And they had a discussion about what they mean by high risk of serious illness. But generally, they made that broad category besides the 65 plus. This week, actually tomorrow tomorrow, Wednesday and Thursday, the CDC's advisory committee will have a similar conversation, but they will be looking at really trying to help clinicians understand who falls into these various categories. So the 65 plus is clear. Who are the people who fall into those high risk serious illness categories, and who should therefore be given a booster dose at least 6 months after their initial primary series. So watch this space. There'll be more to follow. I linked to the very nice press release done by the Pfizer team because I think it lays this out very clearly. Next slide. Lastly, I want to touch on monoclonal antibodies because since we're in the middle of a surge, the ability to get treated is extremely important. And the sooner one can get a treatment, the better chance one has of staying out of the hospital or having a more severe case of COVID. So monoclonal antibodies are a laboratory developed set of antibodies. They're temporary in nature, but what they allow your body to do is look like it's built an entire antibody response and help you fight off the virus more quickly and prevent severe illness. There are 3 companies that have developed monoclonal antibodies, with a 4th on the way from AstraZeneca. They've all received emergency authorization from the FDA, and multiples of them have been acquired by the federal government and are offered free of charge to the American people. They have a very unique recommendation. They're authorized for use if you have a positive test and have had symptoms for less than 10 days and are at risk of having a severe case of COVID. So you need to be in one of the risk categories that makes you more likely to have severe illness. Most importantly, though, it's really important to move quickly after that diagnosis, within those 10 days of symptoms, and request to be treated with one of these products. You do have to get them through infusion. That's an IV. So you have to go to a special location to get them. But you can find those locations online at the HHS site. Oh, I misspelled it. It's hhs.gov. Or you can actually just type in infusion sites in my state, and you'll find places where you can get the monoclonals if you need them, if your doctor doesn't offer it. Most importantly, these have been shown to really reduce the risk of severe disease and hospitalization. And that's the most important thing. How can we get people well faster with a treatment? And obviously, one still can seek vaccination after a certain period of time after the monoclonal antibody. Next slide. So I'll just say a quick word about the president's plan he launched a couple of weeks ago, really putting emphasis on 6 key issues: vaccinating the unvaccinated, protecting the vaccinated, keeping schools open in a safe way, increasing access to testing, protecting our recovery, and improving care with treatments. A lot of different things in the president's plan. You've obviously heard a lot of the discussion about the mask mandates and the vaccine mandates in the press, but as importantly, a reinforcement of the fact that all of these products, the current vaccines, the booster shots, the monoclonal antibodies, access to testing are all going to be free of access to the American people, and that there's investment in the FDA being able to quickly work with companies to review all the clinical trial data for the next wave of vaccinees. Those are the children under 12. So important investments in our public health infrastructure, as well as getting the next round of products through the system. Next slide. So I'll end here with 2 resources we have at Bio, just in case you'd like to look at them. COVID Vaccine Facts is a website we set up at the beginning of the pandemic. It's actually a patient-centric site. Lots of different questions answered. You can type in a question. You can look at the questions. There are videos. There are animations explaining key issues. There are videos of physicians talking about the different questions, interviewing people on the street. So there's lots of resources there to use, both for yourselves as well as for your constituents. And then the bottom page is actually a link to our coronavirus pipeline tracker that's looking at all the different products in development worldwide, and what you can see what's coming next in terms of therapeutics and vaccines that might be impactful. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to the questions.
So we don't have time for a lot of questions, Phyllis, but we do have 2 questions in the chat. The first question is, what advice can you give to those who work with patient populations who are immunocompromised or are hesitant to take the vaccine, given all the education that is out there about the effectiveness about the vaccine? So advice for the groups in regards to the immunocompromised patients?
Absolutely. I think the immunocompromised patient really needs to understand that their risk is actually the highest risk. And quite honestly, that's a patient where exposure to a variant as virulent as Delta could really end up with very bad consequences. So the vaccines actually work well in this population. I think many of those people might not find themselves in a category with the risk of a rare side effect. Those side effects are rare. They really are. Most people have had the vaccine and come through swimmingly, including patients who are relatively delicate and frail, like nursing home patients. So I think we need to help people understand that their risk assessment should be based on the consequences of a bad case of COVID over the very small risk of something bad happening from vaccination. And they want to protect themselves because you really don't know who around you is vaccinated and who isn't. And Delta consequences are quite severe. I think we just need to explore with them what they're nervous about and see if we can get them the right answer.
Sounds good. And finally, what monoclonal antibodies, are they only effective against a specific variant?
No, actually, they're not. They continue to be tested against all the different variants. So most of them actually work well in helping to mount a response against Delta. They're made a little difference. So some of them are a little more effective against Delta than others. But as we do with the vaccines, with the monoclonal antibodies, we keep continuously making sure when new variants show up that we test the effectiveness of the monoclonal antibodies against a case of COVID caused by that specific variant.
So thank you, Phyllis. This was a great session. Attendees, please, we look forward to you attending the next session, Impact of COVID on Patient Advocacy Groups. Thank you for your time and attention.